So, Mike, the W12 is the last in the current line of Mercedes F1 designs with a completely new rulebook coming in next year. So I wondered if you could talk us through, and this might take you some time, the evolution of the car concept from 2014 through to now.
I think when you talk about the evolution of the cars, I think the reality for us as engineers is they sort of blend into one over time, and you kind of really look more at the rule changes. So I think if you sort of go back to that period of time in 2014, we had that huge advantage on the power unit in that first year, and it was about really making sure that we took all the lessons, all the learnings we could from 2014, and we just improved both on the chassis and on the power unit. And I think we sort of carried that through 2015, 2016, having obviously very good seasons. 2017, we had a pretty big rule change. That's when we went to the wider cars, wider front wings, bigger diffusers, rear wing was lowered. And that was a massive change. And we went through winter testing thinking we weren't quite in the right position. And at the end of winter testing, we actually discovered we had a bent setup beam. And so we cross-weighted the cars all the way through that second test. And we only worked it out when the drivers said to us that they could feel a difference in the left and the right-handers. And when we went back through with all the time that you've then got to go through the data, we could clearly see an issue. We turned up in Melbourne with everybody thinking maybe we weren't quite on the pace, with us thinking, well, if that's the answer and we can solve that quite easily, then we'd be better. And obviously, as everybody saw from 2017, we had a pretty good car all the way through that season. I guess the next car probably that's really interesting is the 2019 one, in that at times we sort of struggled with that. I think we had a resurgent Ferrari to deal with, who were very quick, and they pushed us through the vast majority of the season. And then 2020, we again got back to having what felt like a decent advantage. And then you look into this year, and it's the tightest fight we've seen in Formula One for a long, long time. And I think that is a consequence of the fact that the rules are sort of aging, and therefore the cars are converging to some extent. And also some of the changes that happened over the winter probably hurt us more than they hurt other people.
The next topic is low rake, high rake. That's one of the biggest differences between Mercedes and Red Bull. Can you discuss sort of the relative merits of both of them?
It's just a philosophy about where you develop your car. I think if you to look at the Red Bull, my guess is that they have a characteristic in aerodynamics where if you look at the very high ride heights, the drop-off's less than it is for us. And I think that's a sort of a direction they've deliberately chosen, would be my guess. For us, we've chased where we think is the most performance. And while we've had a look at higher ride heights, we just haven't sort of seen the sort of drive to go in that direction. As a consequence, we've just stayed where we are. And I think if you were to ask Red Bull the same question, if there was one of their senior people sat by the side of me, they'd probably be saying the same thing, that they've got their philosophy and they've struggled to see why we've gone our way. And it's just those small differences. And I think what's amazing is if you sort of look at the two cars, they have very different philosophies, but performance-wise, they're pretty close. So there can't be a huge amount in it.
I wanted to delve a little bit more into the differences between the W11 and the W12, and wondered if you'd be able to explain where you spent your tokens and why.
I think in the end we didn't spend our tokens. We had a plan that potentially we'd spend them on the nose, and elected not to in the end. I think the reality was obviously we were in a period of COVID. We were looking at this regulations for next year, which are huge. They're a massive change aerodynamically. And so going into this year, it was all about how do we balance the development we do for this year's car versus the development we do for next year's. At the time we were making those decisions, we also had quite an advantage. If you go back to 2020, we had a very good car, and it was more a case of saying, where are the sort of weaknesses? What are the things that we could go and develop and move on a bit? And they're not big things. They're small things that we'll have seen in the aerodynamic concept. There'll be things we've seen in the flow field we wanted to attack and change. And so I think if you look at the two cars, the details are all in, the differences, are all in details. Now,
one question I wanted to ask was about DAS. So losing that for this year, how much of an effect did that have?
Clearly it has an effect, otherwise we wouldn't have been running it on the car. But I think it's inevitable with things like DAS that they stand out because they're fundamentally something very different. And we developed that system knowing it would allow us to alter the balance through the corners, knowing it would help us with certain aspects of the tyres and things we wanted to do with the tyres. And if we'd have had it available for this year, we'd have definitely been running it. But I think when you look at the differences between the cars and performance, that's a device that's maybe worth a tenth or two at the most. It's not something that's massive, and it's not something that's consistent circuit to circuit. Some circuits it has no benefit, and others it's a small gain. So I think for us as engineers, that the real difference between the cars is all in details, and that's where the performance is coming from.
We were talking earlier about the floor with the aerodynamic regulations. They came in at quite short notice for this year. Yeah. How much of an impact was that, and was it a greater impact or a lesser impact than you had anticipated?
Well, the impact was large for us in terms of was it as we predicted? I think the reality is you don't really try and predict. You put it on the model in the tunnel, you test it in CFD, and you see where you are, and you try and work around it. And what you're trying to do is to sort of look at the changes it makes to the flow field and say, can I recover those same features, those same positive features I had before that change? I think the interesting question is in terms of the effect it had relative to different teams. I think if I go back to that period of time and look at it in hindsight, I suspect we were more impacted than other teams, and we certainly didn't realise that at the time. I think when we first saw the impact, it came predominantly at the sort of the ride heights we were running the car. But that's where you'd expect to take the hit. You take the hit where you've got the biggest performance. And I think as we developed the car, we've started finding there were gains to be had at higher ride heights. In fact, our car this year runs slightly higher ride heights than it did in the previous year as a result of that. But ultimately, the rules are just a game. That's something we have to challenge, we have to attack and deal with. And that's how we approach it.
Now, going back to testing, the car seemed like it was tricky to drive, seemed to have an imbalance. When you've seen that, and going back to what you just said before about the expectations of the challenge it was, how did you go about fixing that in time for the start of the season?
I think it's always really difficult to sort of separate the balance and handling, drivability of the car from the underlying performance. If you've got a quick car, it always handles nicely. It's just one of those things because those fine details no longer matter. So I don't think that this year's car was particularly any worse than ones we've seen previously in terms of handling. I think it's always difficult trying to get the tyres exactly where you want them, exactly in the window, balance front and rear, and working in harmony with the rest of the car, both the chassis and the power unit. And I think at the beginning of the season, we did have some handling issues, but it was probably about our understanding about how you get that sort of last little bit of performance, that last little bit of balance out of the car. And it wasn't so much hardware changes, it was more learning. And I'd say in general, this game is all about learning and understanding. If you know more than the opposition does in terms of the way you develop your car, the way you set up your car, you're always going to be in a better position. So I think if you sort of look through this season, I think we've made a lot of progress in terms of understanding how we want to get the most out of the tyres and out of the car itself. And I think we also did a pretty good job with the upgrades we brought, particularly the Silverstone package. I think took us a good step forward in terms of the car's overall performance, but also its handling.
You're always striving for perfection, but is there one area of the car that you'd like to change?
I've never known a car where when we get to the end of the year and we sit down, we go, that's perfect, because it doesn't exist. The reality is we can always make it better. I think if you look at the position we are in the championship, we didn't start off with a good enough car in comparison to previous years. And we've had various issues through the year in terms of getting the most out of the drivability. The power unit, for instance, has been documented, and the degradation has been another thing. But on our side, I think on the chassis side, you'd look at that and say that we've also struggled to develop the car as much as we've liked. But what I think has been really good is that, as I said, is the team sticking together and finding all of the small gains that were available to find, bolting them on the car. I think the drivers have done a brilliant job this year. Been huge pressure to deal with, and the championship has sort of swung one way then the next and back again. And I guess that's what the fans want to see. And while I'd love to be in a position where we're 4 tenths up the road and it's all easy, that's just not the championship we've had.